The darkness inside the room felt heavier than the wool quilt pulling at Clara Dillard's feet. It was the sort of silence that comes before a storm, or an execution. She lay still, listening to the house wake up around her. Downstairs, the heavy iron stove door clanged shut, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards and into the frame of her bed. It was 4 a.m. In 6 hours, the church bells would ring. In 7 hours, she would stand before the altar. In 8 hours, she would belong to Silas Thorne. Clara pushed the quilt back. The cold air of the room bit at her skin, raising goose flesh on her arms, but the shiver that ran through her had nothing to do with the temperature. She moved to the wash basin, breaking the thin film of ice on the water with her knuckles. As she washed, she avoided looking at the mirror, but the reflection caught her anyway. There was a bruise, yellowing and faint, just above her collarbone. She pulled the neck of her nightdress tight. Silas had done that 3 days ago. He had gripped her there, his fingers like steel rods, just to see if she would pull away. When she had flinched, he had laughed, a dry sound like boots crushing dry leaves. He told her she was skittish, like a filly that needed breaking. Her mother entered the room without knocking. Martha Dillard was a woman worn down by the wind and the hard realities of the frontier until she was as smooth and hard as a river stone. She carried the dress. It was a cascade of white lace and heavy satin, bought with money Silas had already advanced to her father. It looked less like a garment and more like a net. "Put it on," her mother said. Her voice was flat. Clara looked at the dress, then at her mother. "Do not make me do this," she whispered. Martha set the dress on the bed. "Do not start this again. Clara, your father has signed the papers. The debts are paid. Silas is a respected man. He has the biggest ranch in the valley. You will never want for food or heat." "He hurts me," Clara said. Her voice was steady, though her knees shook. Martha turned away, busying herself with the ribbons on the dresser. "A man has a heavy hand sometimes. You learn to move with it, not against it. You will learn to be a wife. Now get dressed. I will come back in 20 minutes to do your hair." The door clicked shut. Clara stood frozen. She looked at the bruise hidden by her nightdress. She thought of her father, sitting in his chair downstairs, smoking his pipe and refusing to meet her eyes for the last month. He had sold her. It was not a marriage. It was a trade of livestock to settle a ledger. She moved not with panic, but with a sudden, terrifying clarity. She did not touch the white dress. Instead, she went to the bottom drawer of her chest. She pulled out her oldest work dress, a dark gray wool that mended easily and hid dirt. She pulled on her sturdy boots, lacing them tight until her fingers ached. She grabbed a rough wool shawl and wrapped it around her shoulders. From the pantry, she would need food, but she could not go downstairs yet. She looked around the room for the last time. She took nothing of value, nothing that Silas or her father could claim she stole to pay her way. She took only a small tin box from under her pillow. Inside was a dried flower from a summer long gone and a small silver thimble that had belonged to her grandmother. She opened the window. The roof of the porch was slick with frost, but the trellis was sturdy. She had climbed it 1,000 times as a child. She climbed it now as a woman running for her life. The ground was hard as iron when her boots hit it. The valley was gray, the sun just a hint of blood red on the eastern horizon. She kept to the shadows of the barn, moving toward the smokehouse. Inside, she grabbed a tin of hard biscuits and a strip of dried beef, shoving them into her pockets. Then the church bells began to ring. It was a practice toll, the sexton waking up the metal. But to Clara, it sounded like the locking of a jail cell. She ran. She did not take the road. The road belonged to horses and wagons and men like Silas Thorne. She cut through the back pastures, her skirts heavy with the morning damp. The grass was stiff with frost, crunching loudly under her feet, every step sounding like a gunshot in the quiet morning. She headed west, toward the jagged line of the mountains that walled in the valley. The locals called them the Sawtooths because they looked like the jaw of a wolf. They were dangerous places, full of deep snow, sudden drops, and timber wolves. But they were the only place Silas Thorne's fences did not reach. By mid-morning, the valley floor was far below her. The air had grown thin and sharp, burning her lungs with every gasp. The polite rolling hills had given way to steep inclines of scree and hard-packed dirt. Thorny brush, starved for water in the winter chill, clawed at her skirts, tearing the hem of the gray wool. She paused to breathe, leaning against a ponderosa pine. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked back, far below, on the winding trail that led up from the ranch lands. She saw them, 4 riders. They were small as ants from this distance, but she knew the way they moved. They were moving with purpose. They were not drifting cattle. They were trekking. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. They knew. Her father must have found the empty room. Silas would have been waiting at the church, checking his pocket watch, his patience thinning until it snapped. She pushed herself off the tree. She had to go higher. The horses would struggle in the steep timber. That was her only advantage. The wind picked up as she climbed, carrying the scent of pine resin and the distinct, metallic tang of snow. The sky above had turned a flat, heavy white. A storm was building over the peaks, ready to spill down into the passes. Clara scrambled over a ridge, her hands raw from grabbing at rough stone and roots. The terrain was fighting her. Every step was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. She was a rancher's daughter, used to work, used to long days. But she had never climbed like this, driven by the terror of being owned. She heard a shout. It was closer than she expected. "Over here, I found a piece of fabric." The voice belonged to one of Silas's foremen, a man named Grady, who enjoyed branding calves a little too much. Clara froze. She looked down at her skirt. A long strip of the gray wool was gone, likely snagged on the last thicket she had pushed through. She was leaving a trail a blind man could follow. She scrambled upward, abandoning caution for speed. She needed to cross the scree field, a slope of loose, fist-sized rocks that shifted underfoot like marbles. She was halfway across when the stone under her right boot gave way. There was no time to catch herself. Clara fell hard, her hip slamming into the granite. She slid 10 feet, the rocks grinding against her skin, tearing the palms of her hands as she tried to break. Her right foot caught in a crevice, twisting violently before snapping free. A cry of pain tore from her throat, echoing off the canyon walls. She clamped a hand over her mouth, but it was too late. The sound hung in the cold air. Below her, the shouting stopped. Then, a voice drifted up, calm and terrifying. "We heard her, up the ridge." Clara dragged herself behind a boulder. Her right ankle throbbed with a sickening, hot pulse. She tried to stand, but the leg buckled instantly, sending white sparks of agony through her vision. She gasped, tears of frustration freezing on her cheeks. She crawled. It was all she could do. She dragged herself over the cold earth, her fingernails packed with dirt, her breath coming in sobbing hitches. She had to get to the timberline. She reached the edge of a creek, the water black and edged with shelves of jagged ice. The cold coming off the water hit her face. She pulled herself forward, intending to drag her body across the rocks to the other side, hoping the water would hide her scent if they brought dogs. Her hand landed on a pile of brush that looked too orderly. A metallic click sounded, sharp and loud. Clara froze. She looked down, inches from her wrist. A heavy iron snare had triggered, the jaws snapping shut on the empty air where her arm had been a second before. If she had been 6 inches to the left, it would have shattered her bone. A trap line. She was in a trapper's territory. A shadow fell over her. Clara flinched, curling into a ball, waiting for Grady's rough hands or Silas's riding crop. She squeezed her eyes shut. Nothing happened. The wind hissed through the pines. The creek burbled over the ice. But there was no blow. She opened her eyes. A man stood 10 feet away. He was not one of Silas's men. He was huge, his shoulders spanning wide enough to block out the gray light of the sky. He wore a coat made of buffalo hide, the fur thick and dark, and buckskin trousers that were black with grease and age. A rifle rested easily in the crook of his arm, the barrel pointing at the ground. His face was a map of the wilderness, weather-beaten skin the color of cured saddle leather. a beard that was dark and streaked with premature gray, and eyes that were the startling, clear blue of glacial ice. A scar ran from his temple into his beard. A jagged white line that spoke of violence survived. He did not speak. He just watched her. He looked at her torn dress, the blood on her palms, the way she cradled her swollen ankle. His gaze shifted to her other hand, where she was white-knuckling the small tin box and a scrap of the wedding ribbon she had unconsciously ripped from her hair. From down the slope, the sound of horses fighting for footing on the rocks grew louder. "There she is! I see gray wool!" The voice was close, maybe 200 yards. Clara looked up at the mountain man. Her voice was gone, lost to fear and cold. She could only look at him with wide, terrified eyes, shaking violently. She was a trespasser on his line, a complication he did not need. He could walk away. He could point them to her. The mountain man tilted his head slightly, listening to the shouts below. His expression did not change. He looked at the snare she had nearly triggered, then back at her face. He made a choice. It was visible only in the slight tightening of his jaw. He stepped forward, moving with a silence that seemed impossible for a man of his size. He slung his rifle over his back and bent down. "Can you stand?" His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding deep underground. It was not a question of politeness. It was a tactical inquiry. Clara shook her head, tears spilling over. "No." He nodded once. He reached down and scooped her up. It was not gentle, but it was efficient. One arm went under her knees, the other around her back. He lifted her as if she weighed no more than a sack of flour. He turned away from the creek, moving not up the slope, but sideways, stepping onto the rocks of the creek bed where his boots would leave no prints. He moved fast, his strides long and sure, navigating the treacherous ice-slicked stones without faltering. Clara buried her face in the fur of his coat. It smelled of wood smoke, pine pitch, and dried blood. It smelled wild. But for the first time since dawn, she did not feel exposed. He carried her for what felt like an hour, though it might have been only 20 minutes. They climbed higher, into the thickest part of the timber where the trees grew so close together the light nearly vanished. The wind howled above the canopy, drowning out any sound of pursuit. He stopped in front of a wall of rock and pushed through a dense thicket of spruce boughs that looked impenetrable. Behind them was a cabin. It was built directly into the side of the mountain, the back wall formed by the living stone of the cliff. The logs were massive, chinked with moss and clay. It was low and squat, designed to let the wind pass over it rather than fight it. There were no windows, only a heavy door made of planks 3 inches thick. He kicked the door open and carried her inside. The warmth hit her first. A fire was banked low in a stone hearth, casting a dull orange glow over the single room. The air was dry and warm. He carried her to a bunk built against the far wall and set her down. He did not speak. He turned and barred the door, dropping a heavy timber into iron brackets. Then he went to the fire, adding a log and stirring the coals until flames licked up. Clara pressed herself against the rough wood of the wall. Her ankle was throbbing with a ferocious rhythm now, the pain making her nauseous. She watched him. He took off his heavy coat, revealing a flannel shirt and a hunting knife strapped to his thigh. He was even bigger without the coat, his arms thick with muscle earned from hard labor. He pulled a wooden stool over to the bunk and sat down. "Let me see the foot." Clara instinctively pulled her leg back, flinching. "I am fine," she stammered. He looked at her, his blue eyes flat and unreadable. "You are not fine, and if that bone is broken, you will never walk down this mountain. Give me the foot." There was no malice in his voice, but there was no room for argument either. Clara slowly extended her leg. His hands were large, the skin rough and calloused, scarred from knife slips and rope burns. But when he touched her ankle, his grip was surprisingly careful. He unlaced her boot with deft fingers, easing the leather off her swollen foot. He peeled back the wool stocking. The flesh was angry, swollen to the size of a grapefruit, turning a mottled purple and blue. He probed the bone with his thumbs. Clara hissed, biting her lip to keep from screaming. Not broken, he said. Bad sprain. Torn ligaments. He stood up and went to a shelf filled with jars and tins. He came back with a tin of salve that smelled of camphor and mint. He rubbed it into the skin, the heat of his hands seeping into the cold injury. "Why are you helping me?" Clara asked. Her voice sounded small in the quiet room. He did not look up from his work. "You were about to step in my trap. Ruin the pelt. Ruin the trap. Break your arm. Too much mess." It was a lie, or at least, not the whole truth. A man like him did not carry a stranger up a mountain just to save a trap. He began to wrap her ankle with strips of clean linen. Suddenly, the mountain man stopped. His hands froze on her foot. He turned his head toward the door, his eyes narrowing. Clara heard it too, the muffled thud of hooves on deep pine needles. A horse snorting. They were right outside. Clara's heart stopped. She opened her mouth to gasp, but the mountain man's hand was there instantly, covering her mouth. It wasn't violent, but it was absolute. His palm tasted of the camphor salve. He put a finger to his own lips, his eyes locking onto hers. Silence. They waited. The fire popped, a sound that seemed deafening. Outside, leather creaked. "I lost the tracks," Grady's voice came, muffled by the thick logs, but audible. "Snow is starting to cover everything." "She can't have gone this high," another voice said. "No woman in a wedding dress climbs 3,000 feet. She is likely dead in a ravine somewhere. Let us circle back to the ridge. The boss will want us to check the caves." The sounds drifted away, fading into the howl of the wind. The mountain man held his position for a long time, listening to things Clara could not hear. Finally, he lowered his hand from her mouth. Clara let out a breath that shook her entire body. "They are gone?" "For now," he said. He finished tying the bandage. "But the storm is hitting. They will go back down to the valley. They are hired men. They will not freeze for a paycheck." He stood up and moved to the small table, cutting a slice of dried venison and pouring water from a bucket into a tin cup. He brought them to her. "Eat." Clara took the food. Her hands were trembling so hard the water sloshed over the rim. She ate the meat quickly, realizing she had not eaten since dinner the night before. The day faded outside, though there were no windows to show it. The only light in the cabin came from the fire, which cast long, dancing shadows against the logs. The wind outside had turned into a shriek, battering the cabin walls. The heavy timber roof creaked under the weight of the snow. The mountain man sat in a chair by the fire, cleaning his rifle. He had not asked her name. He had not asked why she was running. He just existed in the space, a silent guardian who seemed carved from the same rock as the mountain. Clara watched him. She looked at the bruises on her arms, now visible in the firelight. She looked at the torn hem of her dress, the symbol of the life she was supposed to live. She realized she could not stay silent. The silence felt like the secrets she had kept in her father's house. "I am a runaway bride," she said. The words hung in the air, mixing with the smell of wood smoke. The mountain man did not stop cleaning his rifle. He ran an oiled rag down the barrel, his movements rhythmic and slow. He did not look surprised. He did not look scandalized. He looked up at her, the firelight catching the jagged scar on his face. For the first time, the corner of his mouth twitched. It was not a grin of amusement, nor a leer. It was a faint, grim expression that looked like he was recognizing a fellow soldier in a losing war. "Then run straight to me instead," he said. Clara stared at him. The breath caught in her throat. The words were heavy, laden with a meaning she was too exhausted to fully parse. But they settled in her chest like a warm stone. She did not know him. She did not know his name. She was in a cabin with a stranger who could snap her neck with one hand. But outside, the blizzard was burying the world. The wind was a death sentence for anyone caught in the open. The pass was closed. The valley was gone. She looked at the fire, then back at his blue eyes. The choice was simple: stay and live, or leave and freeze. She pulled the buffalo robe he had given her tighter around her shoulders. "I am Clara," she whispered. He nodded, turning back to the fire. "I am Caleb. Get some sleep." "Clara, the snow will be 5 feet deep by morning." Clara lay back against the rough pillow. The dread of the morning was gone, replaced by a strange, suspended reality. She was not a bride. She was not a daughter. She was just a woman in a storm. And for the first time in her life, she was hidden. The world outside ceased to exist. For 7 days, there was no valley, no mountains, and no sky. There was only the white, driving sheet of snow that walled them in, thick as falling ash and heavy enough to snap the limbs of the ancient pines. The wind did not stop. It battered the cabin with a physical weight, a relentless roaring that made the heavy timbers groan in protest. Inside, time became a fluid thing, measured not by the ticking of a clock but by the level of oil in the lamp and the height of the wood pile next to the hearth. Clara learned that survival was a series of small, unglamorous wars. It was the battle to keep the fire fed. It was the battle to melt enough snow in the iron pot to have water to drink. It was the battle to keep the cold from finding the cracks in the chinking. On the 3rd day, her ankle had healed enough to bear weight, though it turned a spectacular shade of violet and yellow. She refused to sit on the bunk while Caleb did everything. She was a rancher's daughter, and idleness felt like a sin. Even here, she tried to split kindling on the small block near the hearth. She held the hatchet awkwardly, her wrist loose, and struck the wood. The blade glanced off, skittering across the stone floor and sparking dangerously close to her skirt. Caleb was there in a heartbeat. He did not yell. He did not snatch the tool from her hand in the way her father would have, with a sneer about women's work. He simply covered her hand with his own. "Hold it higher on the haft," he said. His voice was a low rumble, barely audible over the wind. "You are using your wrist. Use your elbow. Let the weight of the steel do the work." Clara stiffened at his touch. It was an instinct bred into her over the last 6 months, the expectation that a man's hand meant pain or ownership. But Caleb's grip was loose, guiding rather than forcing. "Like this," he said. He stepped back, giving her space. Clara adjusted her grip. She swung, the blade bit clean and true, splitting the pine knot with a sharp crack. She looked up at him, a flush of pride hitting her cheeks before she could suppress it. "Better," he said. He did not smile, but the corner of his eye crinkled. He did not offer praise, and she realized she did not need it. He offered competence. He showed her how to bank the coals so they would last the night. He showed her how to mix flour and water and grease to make bannock bread in the skillet, flipping it when the edges turned the color of dry sand. He never made her feel foolish for not knowing these things. To Caleb, ignorance was just a temporary state, easily fixed by watching and doing. But he had rules. He set boundaries with a plain, unspoken rigidity that transformed the small cabin from a cage into a sanctuary. The bunk against the far wall was hers. He slept on a pallet of buffalo robes near the door, his rifle always within reach. He never crossed the invisible line in the center of the room unless it was necessary. When he had to go outside to check the wood store or clear the vent, he announced it clearly, giving her time to arrange herself. It made the space feel safe. It made her realize that in this tiny, heat-filled room, her body belonged to her. Yet, in the quiet hours when the work was done, she began to see the ghosts that lived there with him. She saw it in the second tin cup on the shelf. It was dented and clean, but she never saw him drink from it. He always used the chipped enamel mug, leaving the tin one gathering dust. She saw it on the 4th afternoon, when she was sweeping the floor with a bundle of stiff twigs. She moved a heavy crate in the corner and found something wedged behind it. It was a small wooden horse, carved from soft pine. It was crude, but loving, the legs sanded smooth by a thumb that had rubbed it over and over. Clara picked it up. It fit in the palm of her hand. Caleb turned from the fire. He went still. The silence stretched out, filled only by the hiss of sap boiling in the logs. He crossed the room and held out his hand. He did not snatch it, but his palm was open and waiting. Clara placed the toy in his hand. "I'm sorry," she said. "I was sweeping." He looked at the wooden horse for a long moment. His face, usually so guarded, cracked, a shadow of old. Deep pain passed behind his eyes, making them look gray instead of blue. He closed his fingers over the toy, hiding it. It belonged to a boy, he said. His voice was rough, like gravel sliding down a chute. He did not say my boy, he did not say my son, but the way he placed the toy back on a high shelf, tucked behind a jar of beans where it could not be seen, shouted the truth louder than any scream. Later, when the wind died down for a brief hour, she looked out the single peephole in the door. Behind the cabin, barely visible through the drifting snow, was a mound of stones. It was shaped like a grave. There was no cross, just a heavy slab of granite to keep the wolves away. She realized then that Caleb was not just a man living alone. He was a man keeping a vigil. That night, the stew was thin, but the warmth of the fire was heavy and comforting. They sat on the floor, the heat soaking into their bones. The intimacy of the storm forced words out of them. "Why did they sell you?" Caleb asked. He was mending a tear in his coat, his needle flashing in the firelight. Clara looked into her cup. It was not a question of curiosity. It was a question of tactical assessment. He wanted to know the enemy. "My father owed money," she said. "The cattle market dropped 2 years ago. We lost half the herd to disease in the spring. Silas Thorne offered to pay the banknotes. He offered to buy the seed for next year. And the price was you," Caleb said. "The price was an alliance," she corrected, though the word tasted like ash. "That is what my mother called it. She said I should be grateful. She said Silas was a strong man. She said a woman's job is to secure the future of her family." "Did he touch you?" Caleb asked. He did not look up from his sewing. Clara flinched. The memory of the bruise on her collarbone throbbed. "He liked to see me afraid," she said quietly. "He told me that gratitude is best shown through obedience. He said he would teach me to be a proper wife, even if he had to use a whip to do it. The townspeople, they all smiled. The reverend, the shopkeeper. They told me I was the luckiest girl in the territory." She looked at Caleb. He had stopped sewing. The needle was still in the leather, but his hand was a fist. The veins in his forearm stood out like cords. "They are wrong," he said. He did not offer a speech about her beauty or her worth. He simply stated the fact as if he were commenting on the weather. "They are wrong. I do not know your last name." She said, "Caleb." He said, "Just Caleb. The rest of it died a long time ago." He looked away, his eyes going distant, focusing on something 1,000 miles and 10 years away. When the wind shrieked outside, sounding like a dying woman, he closed his eyes briefly. The next day, the cabin fever became unbearable. The snow had stopped falling. Though the drifts were 5 feet high, they needed fresh water. The snow melt tasted flat and smoky. "I am going to the creek," Caleb said, pulling on his buffalo coat. "I am coming with you," Clara said. "I need to breathe air that does not smell of smoke." He hesitated, looking at her ankle. "I can walk," she insisted. "I am strong enough." He nodded. "Stay behind me. Step where I step." The world outside was blinding. The sun was hidden behind clouds, but the light reflected off the endless white expanse was searing. The cold hit Clara like a physical blow, freezing the moisture in her nose instantly. They trudged through the deep snow, Caleb breaking the trail. The creek was a ribbon of black and white, the water flowing beneath shelves of ice that extended from the banks. "We need to break the ice near the center," Caleb said. "It is thicker near the edge, but the water is stagnant there." He moved cautiously onto a flat rock that jutted out over the current. Clara followed, mesmerized by the dark water swirling beneath the crystalline sheets. She stepped onto a patch of snow that looked solid. It was not. Beneath the dusting of powder was a shelf of thin, rotten ice. There was a sharp, sickening crack that sounded like a pistol shot. Clara gasped as the ground vanished beneath her right boot. She plunged downward, the icy water grabbing her leg up to the knee. The shock was instantaneous, a paralyzing cold that stole her breath. She scrambled, her hands clawing at the slick ice, but she was sliding. The current pulled at her skirt, heavy and wet, dragging her toward the dark water under the main sheet of ice. "Caleb!" she screamed. He was there before the second syllable left her lips. He did not reach for her hand. He lunged, grabbing the back of her coat and her waist. He planted his boots on the solid rock and heaved back with a grunt of exertion. Clara flew backward, hauled out of the hungry water by sheer brute strength. She slammed into his chest, the impact knocking the wind out of her. He did not let go. He dragged her back, away from the edge, until they were safe in the deep snow of the bank. "Are you hurt?" he demanded. His voice was raw, shouting over the rush of his own blood. Clara was shaking, her teeth chattering violently. "No, I am cold." Caleb gripped her shoulders. His face was inches from hers. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown out. For the first time, she saw fear in him. It was not the fear of a coward. It was the terrified anger of a man who had seen too many people die and refused to watch another. "You do not step where I do not step," he growled. "Do you understand me? The mountain does not care if you are pretty. It does not care if you are running. It will kill you if you are careless." He was angry, but his hands were trembling where they held her. Clara looked up at him. She did not see a captor. She saw a man who was terrified of losing her. "I understand," she whispered. The anger drained out of him, leaving him haggard. He pulled her against him, wrapping the massive buffalo coat around both of them. "We have to get you warm," he said. "Now." The walk back to the cabin was a blur of shivering and adrenaline. Once inside, the heat of the fire felt like a hammer. "Strip," he ordered. He turned his back to her, facing the wall. "Get out of the wet clothes. Wrap yourself in the blankets. I will dry the boots." Clara peeled off the freezing, sodden wool. Her skin was marble white and covered in goose flesh. She wrapped herself in the heavy quilts and sat by the fire, shivering uncontrollably. Caleb turned back only when she said she was covered. He knelt before her, taking her frozen foot in his hands. He rubbed it vigorously, his rough palms creating friction and heat. The sensation was overwhelming. The shift from the deadly cold of the creek to the searing heat of the fire and his hands made her head spin. She watched him. His head was bowed, his dark hair falling over his eyes. He was focused entirely on her warmth. He was broad and scarred and dangerous, but his hands were instruments of healing. Clara's shivering began to subside, replaced by a different kind of trembling. The adrenaline of the near-death experience had stripped away her defenses. She was not thinking about propriety. She was thinking about the beat of the pulse in his neck. She was thinking about the way he had hauled her against him, the solid wall of his chest. She reached out and touched his shoulder. "Caleb." He stopped rubbing her foot. He went very still. He did not look up immediately. "You are warm," he said, his voice thick. "I am," she said. He looked up then. The distance between them was negligible. In the small, firelit room, the air suddenly felt charged, heavy with the scent of wet wool and wood smoke and unvoiced desire. He looked at her mouth. It was a hungry look, a look of starvation that he was fighting to keep behind bars. He stood up abruptly. "I need to check the flu," he said, his voice tight. He retreated to the other side of the room, putting the width of the cabin between them. But the dynamic had shifted. The air was different now. The safety of the cabin was no longer just about survival. It was charged with a magnetic, terrifying pull. That night, the wind howled louder than ever. Clara tossed and turned in her bunk. She dreamed of the church, but it was not a church. It was a slaughterhouse. Silas Thorne stood at the altar, holding a butcher's knife. He was smiling. "Gratitude," he whispered. "Obedience." He reached for her, and his hands were made of ice. Clara woke with a scream caught in her throat. She sat up, gasping, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cabin was dark, save for the dying embers of the fire. "Clara?" Caleb was beside the bunk in an instant. He had moved silently from his pallet. She turned to him, blind with panic, still half trapped in the nightmare. She reached out. He caught her hands. He did not pull away. He sat on the edge of the bunk, his presence a solid anchor in the dark. "I am here," he said softly. "You are safe." "The door is barred. No one gets in." Clara gripped his hands. They were warm. They were real. He was there again, she whispered. Silas, he is not here, Caleb said. He is in the valley. He cannot touch you. Clara looked at him in the gloom. The fear was fading, replaced by a desperate need for connection. She did not want to be alone in the dark anymore. She did not want to be the property of a man who hated her. She wanted to be with this man who had saved her. She pulled on his hands. Hold me, she said. Please, just hold me. Caleb hesitated. She could feel the tension in him, the war between his honor and his want. Then he moved. He did not climb into the bunk. He shifted, sitting next to her, and wrapped his arms around her. He held her against his chest, his chin resting on the top of her head. He held her loosely, giving her the room to pull away if she wanted. He was offering comfort, not taking advantage. Clara pressed her face into his shirt. She could hear his heart. It was beating fast, a heavy, rhythmic thud that betrayed his calm exterior. She lifted her head. His face was inches away, outlined by the faint red glow of the embers. He was looking at her with an intensity that burned. Caleb! She breathed. She leaned in. It was a question. He did not move away. He did not push her back. Their lips met. It was hesitant at first, a brush of skin, a testing of the waters. Clara's breath hitched. She had expected it to be frightening. She had expected to feel trapped. Instead, she felt an explosion of heat. Caleb groaned, a low sound in his throat. His control snapped. Just a fraction. His hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. The kiss deepened, becoming hungry, desperate. It tasted of longing and lonely years. Clara did not pull away. She pressed closer, her hands finding the front of his shirt, gripping the fabric. She wanted this. She wanted the fire. She wanted to burn away the memory of Silas Thorne's cold hands. Caleb broke the kiss, pulling back an inch. His breathing was ragged. Clara, he rasped. Stop me. If you do not want this, tell me to stop. Now. He was giving her the weapon. He was giving her the power. Clara looked at him. She saw the scars, the gray in his beard, the fear in his eyes that he might be doing the wrong thing. I do not want you to stop, she said. Her voice was steady. She kissed him again, fierce and demanding. The rest of the night was a blurring of boundaries. It was not the silent, shameful duty her mother had whispered about. It was a conversation without words. When he touched her, his hands were shaking. He touched her as if she were made of something precious and breakable. Yet he touched her with a possession that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with worship. When she trembled, he stopped. Are you afraid? He asked, his voice rough against her skin. No, she said. I am alive. He made love to her slowly, with a deliberate, agonizing tenderness. He watched her face the whole time, reading her eyes, waiting for her permission in every movement. It was an unearthing. It was a shedding of the girl who had been sold and the birth of a woman who could choose. When it was over, they lay tangled together under the heavy quilts. The fire had died down to ash. Clara felt a wetness on her cheeks. She touched her face and realized she was crying. Caleb stiffened. Did I hurt you? No, she choked out. She buried her face in his neck, sobbing. No, it is just, I did not know it could be mine. I did not know I could choose. He held her tighter, his arms locking around her like bands of iron. He did not speak. He just held her while she wept out the fear and the shame of the last year, letting her leave it all on his skin. She fell asleep with her head on his chest, his hand covering hers. When she woke, the light was different. It was not the dull gray of the storm. It was bright, piercing, and brilliant. Clara sat up, pulling the quilt around her naked shoulders. Caleb was already up, standing by the door. He had opened the peephole. A beam of sunlight cut through the dusty air of the cabin, illuminating the floorboards. The wind had stopped. The silence was absolute. Caleb turned to look at her. His face was solemn. There was no regret in his eyes, but there was a heavy reality. The storm is broken, he said, Clara looked at the sunlight. It was beautiful. It glittered on the dust motes. It meant the snow would settle. It meant the passes would clear. It meant the world could find them again. She looked at Caleb, at the man who had given her back to herself. "How long do we have?" she asked. "A few days. He said maybe a week before the crust is hard enough for horses." He walked over to the bunk and sat down. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the knuckles. "We cannot stay here. Clara, not forever. They will come back. Silas will not stop." "I know," she said. The peace of the snowbound cabin was over. The reality of the West, the cruel, governed, bought and paid for West, was waiting for them at the bottom of the mountain. But as she looked at Caleb, Clara knew one thing. She was not the same woman who had run into the woods in a gray dress. She had run to him, and he had caught her. "We will be ready," she said. Caleb nodded. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, a gesture of old-world courtliness that looked strange and perfect on a man in buckskins. "Yes," he said, "we will be." Outside, the sun shone on the vast, white wilderness, glittering like 1,000 diamonds, beautiful and indifferent to the humans who had to cross it. The flour sack was not just empty, it was shaken clean, the fabric limp and gray in Clara's hands. She turned it inside out over the wooden table, but not even a dusting of white powder fell to the boards. It was the 10th day. The storm had broken, leaving the sky a hard, polished blue that offered no warmth. But the supplies Caleb had stockpiled were gone. They had eaten the last of the venison 2 days ago. The coffee was a memory. The salt was finished. Caleb stood by the door, checking the action on his Winchester. The click-clack of the lever was loud in the small room. He looked at the empty sack in her hands, his jaw setting in that familiar, rigid line. "We have to go down," he said. Clara folded the sack. She felt a tremor in her stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. Going down meant leaving the sanctuary. It meant trading the honest brutality of the elements for the complicated cruelty of people. "I know," she said. She looked at her dress. The gray wool was stained with mud and grease, the hem ragged from the briars, the lace collar long since torn away. She did not look like a bride anymore. She looked like a woman who had been dragged through the wilderness. She looked like something wild. Caleb saw her hesitation. He walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. The weight of it was grounding. "We will go to Granite Ridge," he said. "It is a mining town. Rough. People there mind their own business mostly. We get flour, salt, and ammunition. We listen for news. Then we come back up before the sun sets." Clara nodded, reaching for her shawl. She tied it tight, hiding her hair, hiding her face as best she could. "We are just 2 travelers," she whispered, rehearsing the lie. Caleb did not answer. He opened the door, and the blinding light of the snow-covered world poured in. The descent was harder than the climb up had been. The storm had altered the geography of the mountain. What had been a trail was now a treacherous slide of ice and debris. The switchbacks were buried under drifts that reached Clara's waist. They moved slowly. The air grew heavier as they descended, the thin, crisp atmosphere of the peaks giving way to the damp, cold density of the valley floor. The snow turned to slush, then to a frozen, churned mud that grabbed at Clara's boots like desperate hands. Every step was a labor, the mud sucking at her heels, threatening to twist her healing ankle with every misstep. Caleb moved ahead of her, testing the ground with the butt of his rifle. He was hyper-aware, his head constantly turning, scanning the timberline, the ridges, the shadows of the boulders. By noon, they reached the tree line where the pine forest gave way to the scrub oak of the foothills. The snow here was patchy, revealing the scarred earth beneath. Caleb stopped suddenly. He held up a hand, a sharp gesture that froze Clara in her tracks. He knelt by a cluster of rocks near the trail. Clara moved closer, her breath pluming in the air. "What is it?" she asked. Caleb pointed to the ground. In the mud, half pressed into the frozen earth, was a pile of fresh horse droppings. Steam was still faintly rising from them. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Caleb reached out and plucked something from the crook of a scrub oak branch. He held it up. It was a cigarette stub, the paper dark with saliva, the tobacco end still damp. Someone was here, Caleb said quietly. Less than an hour ago. Are they waiting for us? Clara asked, her voice trembling. No, Caleb said, crushing the cigarette in his fist. If they were waiting, we would be dead. They are searching, sweeping the foothills. He stood up, his blue eyes scanning the horizon. The groom's reach is climbing. Clara, he has not given up. He has hired enough men to comb the mountains. Clara looked at the vast, empty landscape. It suddenly felt crowded. Every shadow looked like a gunman. Every snap of a twig sounded like a trap closing. We should go back, she said. We cannot eat snow, Caleb answered grimly. And if they are this close, they will find the cabin eventually. We need supplies to move further west. We have to go to town. They bypassed the main road, cutting through the dense brush that tore at Clara's skirts and scratched Caleb's face. They entered Granite Ridge from the rear, coming up behind the livery stables and the coal yards. The town was a scar on the valley floor. It was a collection of unpainted clapboard buildings and tents, clustered around a muddy main street that smelled of coal smoke, manure, and unwashed bodies. It was loud. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the shouting of teamsters, the bark of dogs. It all assaulted Clara's ears after the silence of the high country. They stepped onto the boardwalk, trying to blend in. It did not work. Clara felt the eyes immediately. In a town of miners and laborers, a woman was a rarity. A woman who looked like she had walked out of a nightmare was a spectacle. People stopped. A group of men loitering in front of the saloon fell silent as they passed. Their eyes raked over Clara's ruined dress, noting the quality of the fabric beneath the filth, and then moved to Caleb. They looked at Caleb with a mixture of fear and disgust. He was large, dirty, and armed. He looked like the land itself, harsh and unyielding. But worse, he was walking beside her. He was not walking behind her like a servant, nor ahead of her like a master. He was walking beside her, his arm brushing hers. Clara kept her head down, pulling the shawl tighter. She could feel the judgment hitting her like physical blows. To these people, she was not a survivor. She was a woman who had fallen. She was dirty, disheveled, and in the company of a savage. Look at that. A woman whispered loud enough to be heard. Shameful. Clara flinched, but Caleb's hand drifted to the small of her back. It was a light touch, but it steadied her. Ignore them, he murmured. Keep walking. They reached the general store, a large building with goods spilling out onto the porch. Caleb held the door open for her. The warmth inside smelled of coffee beans, leather, and sawdust. For a second, Clara felt a rush of comfort, a memory of her father's kitchen. She walked to the counter. The shopkeeper, a balding man with wire-rimmed spectacles named Mr. Henderson, was weighing nails for a farmer. He looked up as Clara approached. His eyes widened. He took in her appearance, her muddy boots, her tangled hair. His nose wrinkled slightly. He looked past her, as if she were made of glass, and nodded to the farmer. Is that all for you? Jed, he asked. Clara waited. She stood at the counter, her hands gripping the wood. When the farmer left, she spoke. Excuse me, sir, she said. Her voice was steady, though her heart pounded. I need 5 pounds of flour, a bag of salt, and 2 tins of coffee. Mr. Henderson did not answer. He began wiping the counter with a rag, scrubbing at a stain that was not there. Sir, Clara said, louder this time. I would like to make a purchase. The shopkeeper continued to wipe. He did not look at her. It was a specific, practiced kind of invisibility. He was refusing to acknowledge her existence because to acknowledge her was to acknowledge her sin. She was a woman alone, a woman ruined, and therefore she had no voice. The old helplessness rose in Clara's throat, the bitter taste of bile. It was the same silence she had received from her father when she begged him not to sell her. Then a heavy hand slammed onto the counter. The wood groaned. Mr. Henderson jumped, dropping his rag. Caleb leaned over the counter. He took up all the light in the room. The lady spoke to you. Caleb said, His voice was a low growl, vibrating with menace. "Mister." Henderson swallowed hard. He looked at Caleb, and the fear in his eyes was instant. He looked back at Clara, his lip curling. "I do not serve vagrants," the shopkeeper stammered. "If you have coin, show it, but I will not have her begging in here." Caleb reached into his pocket and slammed a gold eagle onto the wood. The coin spun and settled, gleaming in the dim light. Flour, salt, coffee. Now, the shopkeeper scrambled to obey. He did not look at Clara again. He scurried around the shelves, grabbing the items and shoving them into a sack. While he worked, Clara turned away, her face burning with humiliation. She looked at the wall near the door, where notices were tacked up. Her breath stopped. There, framed in bold black ink, was her name. $500 reward for the return of Clara Dillard stolen from her husband-to-be, Silas Thorne. Also wanted, the man responsible for her abduction. Warning, man is armed and dangerous. Clara stared at the words. Stolen. Not run away, not escaped, stolen. The notice stripped her of her will. It claimed she was an object, a piece of property that had been thieved, like a horse or a pocket watch. It claimed she had no agency, that she could not possibly have chosen to leave the comfort of Silas Thorne's wealth. And the reward, $500. It was a fortune. It was enough to buy a farm. It was enough to buy loyalty in a town like this, 10 times over. Caleb stepped up beside her. He saw the poster. He did not say a word, but he ripped it from the wall, crumpling it in his fist. He took the sack of supplies from the counter and grabbed Clara's arm. "We are leaving," he said. They walked out into the street, the air feeling colder than before. The town felt different now. Before, the stairs had been judgment. Now, Clara imagined them as calculations. Every pair of eyes was weighing her against $500. They hurried toward the alleyway behind the saloon, hoping to cut back toward the trail. "Psst! Hey!" The whisper came from a doorway. Caleb spun, his hand flying to his revolver. A woman stood in the shadows of the saloon's back entrance. She was older, her face lined with hardship. Wearing a stained apron, she held a bucket of potato peelings. "You two need to keep moving," she said, her voice low and raspy. "Who are you?" Caleb demanded. "Just a cook," she said. "I saw you walk past. I saw the way you hold yourself." She looked at Clara, and her expression softened. It was not pity. It was recognition. "Silas Thorne has men in town," the woman said. "Not the sheriff's boys. Hired guns, Pinkertons and regulators. They are asking questions at the livery. They are asking about a giant and a girl in rags." "Why are you telling us this?" Clara asked. The woman spat onto the ground. "Because I was a bride once too, and I know what men like Silas Thorne do to things they own. Go, get to the high pass. Do not stop." "Thank you," Clara whispered. The woman nodded and slipped back inside. They moved faster now, panic lending speed to their steps. They turned a corner near the blacksmith shop, aiming for the edge of town. A man stepped out from the shadows of the blacksmith's overhang. He wore a tin star pinned to a pristine vest. Sheriff Barlow was a thick-set man with a mustache that hid his mouth. He was smiling, but his eyes were hard as flint. "Well now," he said. Caleb stopped. He pushed Clara behind him. "Sheriff," Caleb said, "we're just passing through. Are you now?" Barlow said. He did not look at Clara. He looked only at Caleb. He tilted his head, studying Caleb's face. "I know you," Barlow said slowly. "It took me a minute. The beard is new, but I know those eyes. You are Caleb Vance." Caleb went rigid. Clara could feel the tension radiating off him like heat. "That name is dead," Caleb said. "Is it?" Barlow laughed. A dry, humorless sound. "The folks down in Arizona might disagree. They still talk about what you did. The deputy you beat to death with your bare hands. The jail you burned. They say you are a mad dog. Caleb, a killer hiding in the hills." Clara's hand tightened on the back of Caleb's coat. "Killer." She looked at the man she had slept beside, the man who had washed her feet. Was it true? Had he beaten a man to death? Caleb did not deny it. He did not shout. He just stood there, his body a wall between Clara and the law. "I did what was necessary," Caleb said. "Just like I will do what is necessary now. Step aside. Barlow." Barlow's hand hovered over his gun. "I cannot do that. Caleb, there is money on the table. And Mr. Thorne pays better than the county." Barlow whistled. Sharp and loud. Footsteps sounded from the alley behind them. "Men were coming! Run!" Caleb said. He did not wait. He shoved Clara toward a narrow gap between the blacksmith shop and a barn. "Go!" They sprinted into the darkness of the barn, scrambling up a ladder into the hayloft just as the heavy doors below banged open. They threw themselves into the hay, crawling to the back corner where the shadows were deepest. Below them, men shouted, "Search the stalls! They cannot have gone far." Clara lay pressed against the rough wood of the loft floor, her heart hammering so hard she thought it would give them away. Caleb was beside her, his pistol drawn, aiming at the top of the ladder. They lay in the dark, the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light coming through the cracks in the walls. The smell of dry hay and old horses filled their noses. Clara looked at Caleb. His face was a mask of concentration, but there was sweat on his brow. "Is it true?" she whispered. "The deputy?" Caleb did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the ladder. He was hurting a woman. Caleb whispered back, "A prisoner. He was using his badge to do it. I stopped him." He pulled a knife. "I did not stop hitting him until he stopped moving." Clara stared at his profile. Violence, vigilantism. He had killed a man of the law, but he had done it to protect someone helpless, just as he was doing now. The fear that had spiked in her chest twisted into something else. It was not fear of him. It was fear for him. "You are dangerous," she whispered. "I told you that," he said. They lay there, pressed together in the cramped dark, listening to the heavy boots of the men below searching the stalls. The danger was suffocating. Every breath felt stolen. And in that pressure cooker of fear, the desire that had been simmering between them boiled over. It was reckless. It was insane. But the proximity of death made the need to feel life overwhelming. Caleb turned his head. He looked at her. His eyes were dark, dilated with adrenaline and want. Clara reached out. Her hand found the back of his neck. He turned into her touch. His mouth found hers. This kiss was not like the one in the cabin. It was fierce. It was frantic. It was a collision. His hands roamed over her, gripping her waist, tangling in her skirts, desperate to verify that she was there, that she was real. Her hands clutched at his shirt, pulling him closer, wanting to merge with him, to hide inside his strength. It was a boundary-testing moment. There was no gentleness here. There was only the urgent, terrifying need to claim each other before the world tore them apart. They broke apart, gasping for air, their foreheads resting against each other. "We cannot," Caleb breathed. "We have to stay sharp." Clara nodded, her lips swollen, her body humming. "I know." She looked him in the eye. "I am not running for safety anymore." "Caleb," she whispered. He looked at her, confusion warring with the heat in his gaze. "What?" "I am not just running away from Silas," she said. "I am running to you. Even if you are a killer, even if we have nothing, I choose you." Caleb closed his eyes. He looked pained, as if her love was a weight he was not sure he could carry. "You deserve better than a fugitive," he said. "I decide what I deserve," she hissed. "And I decide that I deserve a man who sees me." "Below them," a voice shouted. "Barn is clear. Check the livery." The footsteps receded. Caleb opened his eyes. The softness was gone. The soldier was back. "The livery," he said. "If they are checking the livery, they are watching the horses. But we need mounts. We cannot outrun them on foot in the mud." "What do we do?" Clara asked. "We take the sheriff's wagon," Caleb said. "It is parked out front. It is fast." They climbed down the ladder, moving like ghosts. They slipped out the back door of the barn and circled toward the street. The sheriff's wagon was there, hitched to a pair of sturdy bays, but the street was not empty. Sheriff Barlow stood by the wagon, And with him were 4 men. They wore dusters and low-brimmed hats. They did not look like miners. They looked like predators. There was no way to sneak past. Caleb looked at Clara. "Stay behind the water trough. When the shooting starts, run for the alley." "No," Clara said. "I said—" "Hey!" Barlow shouted. It was too late. They had been spotted. The violence erupted fast and brutal. Caleb shoved Clara down behind a rain barrel just as the first shot rang out. Wood splintered above her head. Caleb returned fire, his Winchester booming like a cannon. One of the hired men spun around, clutching his shoulder, but there were too many of them. They swarmed him. It was not a gunfight. It was a brawl. 2 men tackled Caleb, bearing him to the muddy ground. Caleb fought with the ferocity of a trapped bear. He threw one man into the side of the wagon, the sound of breaking bones sickeningly loud. He struck another in the throat, but the sheriff stepped in. He swung the butt of his rifle, bringing it down hard on the back of Caleb's head. Caleb collapsed, dazed, blood pouring into his eyes. "No!" Clara screamed. She broke from her cover. She did not run for the alley. She ran for Caleb. She threw herself at the sheriff, clawing at his face, screaming in a rage she did not know she possessed. Barlow backhanded her. It was a casual, dismissive blow that sent her sprawling into the mud. "Get her in the wagon," Barlow ordered. Rough hands grabbed her. Clara kicked and bit, but she was lifted and thrown into the bed of the wagon like a sack of grain. She scrambled to her knees. Looking back, 2 men were holding Caleb up. He was swaying, blood masking half his face, but he was still conscious. He was looking at her, his eyes wild with helplessness. Barlow had a pistol pressed to Caleb's forehead. "Do not move! Caleb!" Barlow shouted, "or I will paint the street with your brains." Clara froze. She stopped fighting. "Please," she begged. "Do not kill him." The wagon lurched forward. The driver whipped the horses. Clara gripped the side of the wagon, watching Caleb grow smaller as they tore down the street. He was on his knees in the mud, held at gunpoint, defeated. The wagon turned a corner, and the town disappeared. Clara slumped against the wooden slats, sobbing. Then she heard a sound from the front seat, a match being struck. She looked up, sitting next to the driver, dressed in a pristine black suit that seemed immune to the dust of the town, was a man. He turned slowly to look at her. His face was smooth, handsome in a cold, reptilian way. His eyes were dark and devoid of any light. Silas Thorne smiled. It was a smile of absolute, terrifying ownership. "Hello, my love," Silas said smoothly. He blew a plume of cigar smoke into the cold air. Clara stared at him. The dread that filled her was absolute. This was not the end. The chase was over. The hiding was over. Now, the punishment would begin. The room was wallpapered in a pattern of small blue cornflowers, dizzying in their repetition. To any guest, it was a sanctuary of comfort. A feather mattress thick enough to drown in, a mahogany washstand with a porcelain basin, and a heavy velvet armchair placed by the window. To Clara, it was a cell. The door was made of solid oak, and the lock was new. She could hear the tumblers slide home every time Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, left the room with a dinner tray. The windows were not barred, but they looked out onto the ranch yard where men with rifles sat on the porch of the bunkhouse, smoking cigarettes and watching the house with the boredom of paid sentries. Silas Thorne did not beat her. He did not scream. He did not drag her by the hair as the men in the valley might have expected. His cruelty was far more sophisticated. It was a slow suffocation. He entered the room at 6 in the evening, smelling of bay rum and expensive tobacco. He sat in the armchair, crossing his legs, and watched her brush her hair. "You look pale, my dear," Silas said. His voice was smooth, like oil pouring over gravel. "It is the strain. I suspect. The hysteria. I am not hysterical," Clara said. She sat at the vanity, her hands gripping the ivory handle of the brush until her knuckles turned white. Silas tutted softly. He stood up and walked behind her, placing his hands on her shoulders. His touch was light, possessive, and terrifying. "You ran into a blizzard. Clara, You consorted with a fugitive. You made a spectacle of yourself in Granite Ridge. A sane woman does not do such things. A sane woman understands her place is in the warmth of her husband's house, not freezing in a cave with a murderer. He leaned down, his face next to hers in the mirror. The town is very concerned. He whispered, "They are praying for you. They believe your mind has snapped under the pressure of the wedding. It is a tragedy, they say. But I have told them I will care for you. I will keep you safe from your own delusions." He was rewriting reality. He was building a cage out of concern, painting her as a madwoman so that if she ever spoke the truth, no one would listen. "Now," Silas said, straightening up, "it is time for prayer. We must ask the Almighty to cleanse your spirit of rebellion." He forced her to kneel on the rug beside the bed. He knelt beside her, his hand gripping her wrist, squeezing just hard enough to bruise. He prayed for 10 minutes, his voice droning about obedience, submission, and the sin of ungrateful wives. Clara knelt, her knees aching, and stared at the floor. She did not pray. She recited the layout of the house in her mind. Kitchen, east wing, study, ground floor, facing the paddock, back door, locked from the inside. When he left, locking the door behind him. Clara did not cry. She went to the window and pressed her hand against the cold glass. Somewhere out there, in the dark fold of the foothills, was Caleb, unless he was dead. The thought nearly buckled her knees, but she pushed it away. He was not dead. A man like that did not die in the mud of a street fight. He was alive, and if he was alive, he was coming. Caleb was not dead, but he was close enough to it that he could hear the reaper sharpening his scythe. He lay in a thicket of scrub oak 3 miles from the town, shivering uncontrollably. The sheriff's rifle butt had opened a gash on the back of his head that throbbed with a sickening, heavy rhythm. His vision swam in and out of focus, doubling the moon. He had crawled out of the alley where they had dumped him. They had thought he was finished, or perhaps they just did not care enough to put a bullet in him, assuming the cold would do the job. He ate snow to quell the nausea. He tied a strip of his shirt around his head to staunch the bleeding. He forced himself to stand. The world tilted violently, then righted itself. He began to walk. He did not walk toward the high country. He walked toward the one place Silas Thorne would not expect him to go. He walked toward the railway camp on the edge of the valley. He found Tobias in a rusted corrugated shack near the siding. Tobias was a cripple, a man with a twisted spine who had once worked the Thorne stables until a horse kick had ruined him. Silas had fired him without a penny, leaving him to beg or starve. Caleb kicked the door. Tobias opened it, a shotgun in his hands. He saw the blood-soaked giant swaying in the moonlight and lowered the weapon. "Ghost of Almighty." Tobias breathed. "I heard you were dead." "Caleb." "Not yet." Caleb rasped. "I need water, and I need to know where Thorne keeps his ledgers." Tobias pulled him inside. The shack smelled of coal oil and sickness, but it was warm. He gave Caleb water and a tin of beans. While Caleb ate, his hands shaking, Tobias spoke. He spoke with the bitterness of a man who had been discarded like refuse. "He keeps the real books in the carriage house," Tobias said, "under the floorboards in the tack room. I saw him put them there once when I was mucking out. He does not keep them in the house. He thinks the house might burn, but the tack room is stone." "What is in them?" Caleb asked. "Everything." Tobias said, "The cattle he rustles from the Mexican border, the bribes he pays to Sheriff Barlow, the deeds he forged to take the Miller farm and the widow Hennessy's land." Caleb nodded. The pain in his head was a dull roar now. "Manageable. I need those books," Caleb said. "You cannot get near the ranch," Tobias warned. "He has hired guns riding the perimeter." "He has dogs." Caleb stood up. He looked at his hands. They were battered, the knuckles raw, but they were steady. "I do not need to fight an army," Caleb said. "I just need to be a ghost." Clara learned to be a ghost too. For 3 days, she played the role Silas wanted. She sat quietly at dinner. She nodded when he spoke. She allowed him to read the Bible to her. Her compliance made him careless. On the 4th day, he left the key to the library in the lock while he went to shout at a stable hand. Clara slipped inside. She did not know what she was looking for exactly, but she found the map on the desk. It was a survey map of the valley. Red lines were drawn across the properties of her neighbors, the small homesteads, the struggling farms, crossed out, all of them, written in the margin, in Silas's sharp, angular hand. Water rights secured. Eviction notices prepared for January 1st. He was not just buying them out. He was diverting the creek. He was starving them of water until the land was worthless, then buying it for pennies. Her marriage was part of this. Her father's land controlled the access to the North Pass by marrying her. Silas secured the bottleneck. He did not want a wife. He wanted a toll road. She heard a footstep in the hall. Clara froze. She could not get out. She ducked behind the heavy velvet drapes of the window. The door opened. It was not Silas. It was Hattie, the older maid who brought the coal for the fires. Hattie walked into the room, carrying a scuttle. She saw the map on the desk, moved slightly out of place. She stopped. She looked at the drapes. Clara held her breath. Hattie did not call out. She walked to the fireplace and began to shovel ash. She spoke to the empty room, her voice low and hurried. "The master checks the locks at 10, Hattie said, "but he leaves the pantry window unlatched for the cat. The dogs run the perimeter on the hour. The gap between shifts is 5 minutes." Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. Hattie stood up and dusted her hands. She did not look at the window. "He killed the first one," Hattie whispered. "His first wife. She did not die of fever. She died because she tried to leave, and he locked her in the cellar for a week without heat. Do not let him keep you, child." Hattie picked up the scuttle and left. Clara sagged against the wall, trembling. She was not alone. The house was a prison, but the inmates were whispering to each other. The storm hit that night. It was a blessing. The wind screamed down from the peaks, driving snow horizontally across the valley, blinding the sentries and muffling the sound of footsteps. Caleb moved through the blizzard like a part of the landscape. He had wrapped his boots in burlap to muffle the tread. He wore a white canvas tarp over his coat, rendering him invisible against the snow. He approached the ranch from the north, crawling on his belly through the frozen irrigation ditch. The water was gone, leaving only mud and ice. He reached the barbed wire fence. He did not cut it. The sound of the wire snapping would be too loud in the lulls of the wind. He dug. He scraped the frozen earth away with his knife until there was a shallow depression, just deep enough to slide his massive frame under the bottom wire. He was inside. He moved toward the carriage house. He could see the main house through the swirling snow, the windows glowing with warm, yellow light. He imagined Clara inside, trapped in that warmth, and the rage in his gut burned hotter than the fever he was fighting. He reached the heavy stone building of the carriage house. The door was locked. Caleb went to the side window. It was small, high up. He found a loose stone in the wall, a foothold. He pulled himself up, silent as smoke. The window was unlatched. Tobias had been right about the carelessness of arrogant men. He slipped inside, dropping onto the straw-covered floor of the tack room. The smell of leather, saddle soap, and horse sweat surrounded him. It was dark, but he knew where to look. He knelt by the feed bin, feeling for the loose board Tobias had described. A shadow detached itself from the row of saddles. Caleb spun, his knife in his hand before his conscious mind registered the movement. "Caleb?" The whisper was barely a breath. He froze. Clara stood there, wrapped in a dark shawl, her feet bare on the freezing stone. She had come through the pantry window, through the snow, to the one place she felt she could think. Clara. The knife clattered to the floor. He crossed the distance in 2 strides. He did not ask if she was hurt. He did not ask how she got there. He grabbed her, pulling her against him with a force that knocked the breath out of her. Clara buried her face in his frozen, wet coat. She wrapped her arms around his neck, digging her fingers into the damp fur. She was shaking, violently and uncontrollably. "I thought you were dead," she sobbed into his chest, her voice muffled. "I saw the blood. I thought he killed you." "I am hard to kill," Caleb murmured, burying his face in her hair. He smelled of snow and old blood and iron. He pulled back, his hands framing her face. In the dim light coming from the window, he looked terrifying. His eye was swollen shut, his forehead wrapped in a bloody rag, his beard matted with ice. But to Clara, he was beautiful. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his good eyes scanning her. "Did he touch you?" "No," she said. "He prays at me. He locks me in. But he has not hit me." "Caleb, I found the map. I know what he is doing. I know too," Caleb said. "The ledgers are here, under the floor." They stared at each other. The information was important, but it was secondary to the overwhelming, crushing relief of being in the same room. The tension that had broken in the barn loft before the ambush returned now, magnified by the days of separation and the knowledge of what Silas intended. Caleb's hands moved from her face to her shoulders, then down her arms, gripping her waist. He pulled her closer, until there was no air between them. "We have to go," he said, but he did not move. "Not yet," Clara whispered. She kissed him. It was a reclaiming. It was a desperate assertion that she was not Silas Thorne's property, not a madwoman, not a victim. She belonged to herself, and she chose to give herself to this man in the dark. They sank onto a pile of horse blankets in the corner. The tack room was freezing, but the heat between them was blistering. It was not a gentle loving. It was urgent and raw, hands fumbling with buttons, breath bitten back to keep silent. When his skin touched hers, it felt like branding iron. Clara cried out softly, and Caleb covered her mouth with his own. Swallowing the sound, he moved with a desperate hunger, as if he were trying to memorize the feel of her in case they died in the next hour. For Clara, it was an exorcism. Every touch of his rough hands erased a layer of the politeness and the fear Silas had wrapped her in. She arched into him, meeting his intensity, demanding more. When it was over, they lay tangled in the blankets, their breath clouding the air. Caleb held her, his hand stroking her hair, his heart beating a heavy rhythm against her back. "We have to move," he whispered. "The guard changes in 10 minutes." Clara sat up. She felt raw, exposed, and incredibly strong. "Get the ledgers," she said. Caleb pried up the floorboard. Beneath, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 heavy books. He shoved them into his coat. They slipped out of the carriage house into the storm. They did not go to the stables. The horses would make too much noise. They went on foot, running into the teeth of the blizzard, heading for the Badlands where the rocks were sharp enough to cut boots to ribbons. They ran until their lungs burned like they had inhaled fire. They ran until Clara's feet were numb blocks of wood. They ran until the sun began to bleed a gray light over the eastern horizon. Behind them, the sound of gunshots echoed flatly against the hills. The alarm had been raised. They entered the Badlands, a twisted landscape of sandstone spires and deep, dry canyons. It was a place where nothing grew and nothing lived unless it fought for every second. They found a shallow cave, little more than an overhang in a canyon wall, shielded by a fallen slab of rock. They collapsed inside, gasping. Caleb checked his rifle. 3 cartridges left. He checked Clara. Her feet were bleeding through her stockings. He took off his coat and wrapped it around her. He tore strips from his shirt and began to bind her feet. "You are hurt too," Clara said, touching the bandage on his head. It had bled through again. "It is nothing," he said. "It is not nothing," she said. She took the cloth from his hands. "Let me." She tended to him. She cleaned the gash with snow, her touch firm and capable. She was no longer the girl who flinched at the sight of a snare. She was a partner. They sat in the silence of the cave, watching the snow drift across the canyon floor. "Why?" Caleb asked quietly. "Why did you really run that morning?" It was not just the fear of being hit. Clara looked at the sandstone wall. "I was taught that I was a trade," she said. Her voice was steady. "My mother told me that a woman's value is in what she can provide for her family. My obedience was the currency. I believed it. For years, I believed that if I was just good enough, quiet enough, obedient enough, I would be happy. She looked at Caleb. But that morning, I looked in the mirror, and I saw that there was no end to it. I would be obedient until I died, and it would never be enough. Silas would consume me, and my father would count the money, and I would just disappear. I ran because I wanted to be someone who existed. Caleb nodded. He understood disappearing. I had a wife, he said. The words fell into the space between them like stones. Clara watched him, waiting. Her name was Mary. He said, we had a small homestead in Arizona. Good land, water. Then the mining company came. They wanted the water rights. I refused to sell. He picked up a pebble and crushed it in his fingers. They dammed the creek upstream. Our crops died. Then the fever came. Mary got sick. I went to the town to buy medicine. The company store refused to sell to me. They said my credit was no good until I signed the deed. His voice went cold, devoid of inflection. I rode back home. Mary died that night. She died burning up, holding my hand, asking for water I could not give her. Clara reached out and took his hand. It was trembling. I buried her, Caleb said. Then I went back to town. I walked into the company office. The manager was there. The sheriff was there. They had the deed on the table. I locked the door. I beat the sheriff until he could not stand. Then I beat the manager until he stopped breathing. I burned the office down with the deed inside. He looked at Clara, his blue eyes haunted. That is why they call me a monster. Because I did not just kill him. I enjoyed it. For 5 minutes, while I was breaking him. I felt like there was justice in the world. He pulled his hand away. Now you know. I am not a hero. Clara, I am a man with blood on his hands. Clara looked at him. She saw the pain he had carried for 10 years. She saw the violence that had been born of love and grief. She moved closer to him. She took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. You are not a monster, she said fiercely. You are a man who fought back, and you are the man who saved me. She kissed his forehead, right over the bandage. We are done running. Caleb. He looked at her, confusion clouding his gaze. What? We have the ledgers, she said. We have the map. We know what Silas is doing. If we keep running, he will hunt us until one of us is dead. He will take the land from the widow Hennessy. He will take the water. He will win. She grabbed his shoulders. I am done being a victim. I am done hiding in caves. Caleb looked at the ledgers wrapped in oilcloth. He looked at Clara's fierce, determined face. He saw the fire in her, a fire that matched his own. He slowly reached out and took his rifle. He checked the action one last time. We cannot go back to Granite Ridge, he said. The sheriff is bought. Then we go to the county seat. Clara said, we go to the judge in Silverton. We take the proof to someone Silas cannot buy. It is a 3-day ride, Caleb said, through open country. They will be on us before noon. Then we fight, Clara said. Caleb looked at her. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. It was not the smile of a man running for his life. It was the smile of a man who finally had something worth fighting for. Yes, he said. We fight. He stood up and offered her his hand. Let us go start a war. Clara. Clara took his hand. She stood up, wincing on her blistered feet but standing tall. Together, they walked out of the cave and into the blinding light of the Badlands, leaving the shadows behind them. The road to Silverton was not a road at all. It was a network of deer trails, dried creek beds, and shadow lines that skirted the edge of civilization. They moved like ghosts, passing through the fringes of the territory where the law was just a suggestion and survival was the only religion. Clara rode a roan mare they had bartered for in a mining camp, trading a gold locket for the animal. Caleb walked beside her, his hand resting near the stirrup, his rifle a permanent extension of his arm. The bandage on his head was fresh, wrapped by a Chinese rail worker who had shared his rice and his fire with them 2 nights ago. They were not just running anymore. They were collecting. In the mining camp of Blackwood, they found the widow of the man Caleb had allegedly murdered 10 years ago. She was running a laundry tent, her hands red and raw from lye soap. She did not scream when she saw Caleb. She looked at him with tired eyes and told Clara the truth that the town refused to print Her husband had been a drunk who beat her until her ribs cracked, and Caleb Vance had been the only man to step between them. In a logging settlement near the river, they found a timber surveyor who had been fired by Silas Thorne for refusing to falsify property lines. He gave them a signed affidavit, his hands shaking from years of cheap whiskey, but his memory sharp as a saw blade. "We are building a rope," Clara said as they camped that night under a shelving rock, strand by strand. "We are going to hang him with the truth." Caleb sat cleaning his Winchester, the firelight catching the grim set of his jaw. He looked at the papers tucked into Clara's saddlebag. Paper burns. "Clara, men like Silas do not fear ink. They fear lead. He is terrified of ink." Clara insisted. She knelt beside him, placing her hand over the mechanism of the gun, stilling his restless fingers. "He is terrified that the world will see him as he is. If you kill him, he becomes a martyr, a tragedy. If we expose him, he becomes a criminal." Caleb looked at her. The rage in him was a living thing, coiling in his gut. He had spent 10 years believing that violence was the only language the West understood. But looking at Clara, seeing the fierce intelligence in her eyes, he began to doubt his own cynicism. They descended into the valley of Silverton 3 days later. It was the county seat, a place of brick buildings, paved sidewalks, and the illusion of order. The atmosphere in the town was brittle. News of the runaway bride had traveled, twisted by gossip until it was a dime novel legend. Some said she was a harlot who had seduced a savage. Others said she was a captive being held for ransom. When they rode into the outskirts, the stares hit them like physical blows. Clara wore a dress of dark calico, mended and clean, given to her by the washerwoman. She sat tall in the saddle. She did not hide her face. A group of church ladies, standing outside the mercantile, stopped their conversation as Clara passed. They gathered their skirts, pulling the fabric tight against their legs as if Clara's shadow might stain them. "Whore," one of them whispered. The word carried clearly across the dusty street. Caleb stopped walking. His hand dropped to his pistol. The movement was so fast, so fluid, that the women gasped and stumbled back. "Caleb," Clara said. Her voice was sharp. He looked up at her. His eyes were blue ice, burning with a protective fury that threatened to scorch the street. "Do not," she said. She swung down from the horse. Her boots hit the dirt with a solid thud. She handed him the reins. She walked over to the women. She did not shout. She did not lower her head. She stood 3 feet from the matron who had spoken, a woman in fine silk and a bonnet adorned with fake cherries. "My name is Clara Dillard," she said. Her voice was steady, projecting the way she had practiced in the echo of the canyon. "I am not a whore. I am a woman who refused to be sold like a broodmare to a thief. If you wish to judge me, do so after you have heard the truth. Until then, keep your tongue behind your teeth." The woman gaped, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. She had expected shame. She had expected a cowering girl. She did not know what to do with a woman who looked her in the eye. Clara turned and walked back to Caleb. She did not rush. Caleb watched her, and the rage in his chest shifted, transforming into a desperate, aching pride. They found sanctuary at the edge of town, in the small, cluttered home of Dr. Amos Lowe. The doctor was a man who smelled of carbolic acid and stale tobacco, with a face that looked like a crumpled map. He had treated the poor of the valley for 40 years, and he knew exactly where the bodies were buried because he had signed the death certificates. He ushered them inside and locked the door. "You are walking into a lion's den," the doctor said, pouring thick black coffee into chipped mugs. "Silas is here. He is staying at the Grand Hotel. He has the sheriff, the mayor, and half the Cattlemen's Association in his pocket. We have the ledgers," Clara said, placing the oilcloth-wrapped bundle on the table. "Doctor." Lowe looked at the books. He sighed, a long, rattling sound. "Ledgers are good, but Silas is holding a land auction tomorrow at the courthouse steps. He is selling the deeds to the properties he seized, the widow Hennessy's farm, the Miller place. He is framing it as a charitable act, selling foreclosed land to new families. He is selling stolen land to launder the title, Caleb said. His voice was a low rumble from the corner of the room. Exactly, the doctor said. The town is turning out for it. It is a spectacle. Then we make it a trial. Clara said, Doctor. Lava looked at her. You realize what they will do? They will not just shout you down. They will try to arrest you. Barlow has a warrant for Caleb's hanging. Let them try, Caleb said. The night before the auction was agonizing. The house was quiet, but outside, the town was restless. Riders passed by the window, their shadows stretching long across the floorboards. Clara stood by the window, watching the street. The fear was returning, gnawing at her resolve. It was one thing to be brave in the mountains. It was another to face a crowd of 500 people who had already decided she was a sinner. Caleb came up behind her. He did not touch her at first. He stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. You do not have to do this, he said softly. We can leave tonight. We can go to Oregon, disappear into the timber. Clara turned to face him. In the dim light, the scars on his face were stark, a map of the violence he had endured. If we run, she said, Silas wins. He takes the land. He crushes the widow Hennessy. He finds another girl to marry and break. And we spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, waiting for the bounty hunters. I can protect you, Caleb said. I know, she answered. She reached out and took his hand. It was rough, calloused, the knuckles scarred from a lifetime of fighting. But I do not want to be protected anymore. Caleb, I want to be free. She lifted his hand to her face, pressing her cheek against his palm. I love you, she whispered. Caleb went still. It was the first time she had said it. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. He let out a breath that sounded like a man surfacing from deep water. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into him, burying his face in the crook of her neck. I have nothing to give you, he rasped. I have a price on my head and a horse. That is it. You have me, she said, and that is enough. They stood there for a long time, holding onto the fragile peace of the moment. The desire between them flared, hot and urgent, but they did not move toward the bed. This was not a night for losing themselves. It was a night for finding the steel in each other's spines. The morning of the auction dawned cold and clear. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, indifferent to the drama unfolding below. The courthouse square was packed. Men in suits stood shoulder to shoulder with miners in canvas coats. Wagons lined the streets. On a raised wooden platform, Silas Thorne stood next to the auctioneer. Silas looked impeccable. He wore a charcoal suit, a silk tie, and a white Stetson. He smiled at the crowd, shaking hands, playing the role of the benevolent patriarch. Sheriff Barlow stood at the foot of the stairs, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt, his eyes scanning the crowd. Clara and Caleb walked down the center of the main street. They did not sneak. They did not hug the shadows. They walked side by side. Doctor Lou walked 10 paces behind them, carrying the ledgers. Behind him, a strange procession had formed. The washerwoman from Blackwood, the timber surveyor, the Chinese rail workers, a dozen others, people who had been cheated, beaten, or silenced by Silas Thorne. They walked in silence, a ragged army of the disenfranchised. The crowd parted. It was not out of respect. It was out of shock. Look at him, a man muttered. That is the killer. Vance, look at her, a woman whispered. She has no shame. Holding his hand in broad daylight, Clara heard them. She felt the heat of their judgment burning her skin, but she did not let go of Caleb's hand. She tightened her grip. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, a silent pulse of reassurance. They reached the edge of the square. Silas saw them. His smile did not falter, but his eyes went dead. He tapped the auctioneer on the shoulder and whispered something. The auctioneer stopped his chant. The silence that fell over the square was sudden and total. Silas stepped to the edge of the platform. Clara, he called out. His voice was warm, projecting easily to the back of the crowd. Thank heavens! We had feared the worst. He opened his arms. Come up here, my dear. You have been through a terrible ordeal. Let us get you away from that animal. The crowd murmured in agreement. The narrative was set. The poor, addled girl, rescued by the loving fiancé. Clara did not move toward the stairs. She let go of Caleb's hand and stepped forward into the empty space between the crowd and the platform. "I am not an animal's captive. Silas," she said. Her voice rang out, clear and steady. "And I am not your dear." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. Women gasped. Men frowned. Silas's smile tightened at the edges. "You are confused. Clara, the strain has been too much. Sheriff, please escort Miss Dillard to the hotel and arrest the man who kidnapped her." Sheriff Barlow stepped forward, his hand dropping to his holster. "You heard him. Caleb." Hands in the air. Caleb did not raise his hands. He stood like a boulder, his coat swept back to reveal the pistol at his hip. "I am not here to fight, Barlow," Caleb said. "Unless you start it. I am here to speak." Clara interrupted. She turned to the crowd. She looked at the faces, the shopkeepers who had refused her service, the farmers who looked away. "You are here to buy land." She said, "Do you know where it comes from?" She pointed at the platform. Silas Thorne did not buy the Miller farm. He dammed the creek and starved their cattle until they had to sell for the price of a train ticket. He did not foreclose on the widow Hennessy. He forged her signature on a deed transfer 3 days after her husband died. "Lies!" Silas shouted. His composure cracked. "Just a hairline fracture. This woman is hysterical. She has been corrupted by a fugitive. Doctor!" Lowe stepped forward. He held up the ledgers. "I have the proof," the doctor shouted. "In Silas's own hand. The bribes paid to the sheriff. The payments to the men who burned the Miller barn. It is all here." The crowd shifted. Unease rippled through them. They looked from the doctor to Silas, then to the sheriff. Silas's face turned a mottled red. He realized the trap had snapped shut. He could not talk his way out of ledgers. "Arrest them," Silas screamed. He pointed a shaking finger at Caleb. "Kill him! He is armed!" Sheriff Barlow drew his gun. The violence did not start with a duel. It started with panic. One of Silas's hired men, perched on a wagon roof with a rifle, saw Caleb's hand move. He fired. The shot cracked through the air. The bullet missed Caleb and struck a wooden post near Clara's head, sending splinters flying into her hair. Chaos erupted. The crowd screamed and scattered. A stampede of bodies pushing and shoving to get away from the line of fire. "Get down!" Caleb roared. He tackled Clara, throwing her to the ground and covering her body with his own as a second shot whizzed past. Gunfire erupted from all sides. Silas's men were shooting indiscriminately into the street. The sheriff was firing at Caleb. Caleb rolled, bringing his Winchester up. He fired twice. The hired man on the wagon roof tumbled backward, hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. "Stay down," Caleb ordered Clara. He rose to a crouch, moving away from her to draw the fire. He was a lightning rod for the bullets. Silas was fleeing. He had abandoned the platform and was running toward the alleyway behind the courthouse, his white hat lost in the mud. "He is getting away!" Clara screamed. Caleb saw him. He saw the man who had treated Clara like cattle, the man who had poisoned the valley. Caleb broke cover. He sprinted across the open square, bullets kicking up puffs of dirt around his boots. He did not fire. He ran with the terrifying speed of a predator. Silas reached his horse, fumbling with the reins. He pulled a derringer from his vest pocket. Caleb was 10 feet away. Silas turned and fired. The small bullet hit Caleb in the left shoulder. The impact spun him around, blood spraying onto the dust. Caleb did not fall. He stumbled, roared a sound of pure animal rage, and lunged. He tackled Silas, dragging him off the horse. They hit the ground hard. Silas's expensive suit tore, his face slammed into the mud. Caleb pinned him. He raised a fist, his knuckles white. He could end it. One blow to the temple. It would be easy. It would be justice for Mary. It would be justice for Clara. Silas whimpered, throwing his hands up. "Don't! Please!" Caleb's fist hovered in the air. He was breathing hard, blood dripping from his shoulder onto Silas's white shirt. Clara was there. She had run through the chaos, ignoring the shouting sheriff. "Caleb!" she screamed. Caleb looked up. He saw Clara standing there, her eyes wide, her chest heaving. "Do not do it," she pleaded. "Do not prove them right." Caleb looked down at Silas, who was sobbing in the mud, a pathetic, broken figure. He looked at his own fist. If he killed him, he was the monster they said he was. If he let him live, he was a man who had chosen something better. Caleb slowly lowered his hand. He grabbed Silas by the lapels and hauled him up, throwing him toward the sheriff, who had finally reached them with his gun drawn. "Take him," Caleb growled. "The evidence is on the table. If you let him go, the whole territory will know you are bought." Sheriff Barlow looked at the crowd that had stopped running and turned to watch. He looked at Dr. Lowe holding the ledgers. He looked at Caleb, bleeding but standing tall. Barlow knew which way the wind was blowing. He holstered his gun. "You are under arrest." "Mr. Thorne," Barlow said, his voice flat. Silas shrieked, struggling, but the deputies grabbed him. It was over. Caleb turned to Clara. He took one step toward her and stumbled. His face went gray. "Caleb?" He fell to his knees. The wound in his shoulder was bad. The bullet had hit something deep. Blood was soaking the entire left side of his shirt. Clara dropped to the ground, catching him before he hit the dirt. "Help!" she screamed. "Doctor! Doctor!" Lowe was already running toward them. Caleb looked up at Clara. His eyes were hazy, losing focus. "Did we win?" he whispered. "Yes," Clara cried, pressing her hands against the wound to staunch the flow. "We won. You did it." Caleb smiled, a faint ghost of a smile. "Good," he breathed. His head lolled back against her arm. The town square was loud with shouting, with the sheriff barking orders, with the crowd murmuring. But for Clara, the world narrowed down to the man in her arms and the terrifying amount of blood on her hands. "We have to move him! Doctor!" Lois shouted. "Get him to my house! Now!" Two men, the timber surveyor and a miner, rushed forward to lift Caleb. Clara stood up, her dress stained with the blood of the man she loved. She looked at Silas being dragged away in handcuffs. She looked at the crowd that was now watching her with a mixture of awe and pity. She did not look down. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked beside the men carrying Caleb. She had chosen the fight. Now she had to survive the cost. The smell of carbolic acid and stale blood hung heavy in the back room of Dr. Lowe's house. For 3 days, Caleb burned with fever, his body fighting the infection that bloomed from the bullet wound in his shoulder. He tossed on the narrow cot, muttering names from a past Clara did not know, his hands grasping at invisible enemies. Clara did not leave his side. She wrung out cool rags in a basin of vinegar water, wiping the sweat from his forehead. She forced willow bark tea between his cracked lips. But she did not only nurse him, she worked, while Caleb slept the fitful sleep of the dying. Clara sat at the doctor's desk, copying names and dates from the stolen ledgers. She wrote letters to the federal marshal in Denver, to the territorial governor, and to the newspapers in the capital. She knew that Sheriff Barlow would not hold Silas Thorne for long. A man like Silas did not stay in a cell. He bought the keys. The spring thaw had arrived with a vengeance. The warm Chinook winds roared down from the peaks, melting the heavy snowpack in a matter of 48 hours. The valley turned into a quagmire of sucking mud. The creeks swelled into raging torrents, brown and choked with debris. The world was shedding its white skin, revealing the ugly, scarred earth beneath. On the 4th morning, the sheriff released Silas. Lack of evidence, Barlow claimed, spitting tobacco juice onto the doctor's porch steps. The ledgers are circumstantial, and Mr. Thorne has friends who vouch for his character. Clara stood in the doorway, blocking the sheriff's view of the wounded man inside. She wore the same calico dress, now stained with the labor of caretaking, but she looked like iron. "He is not free," Clara said. "He is just loose. There is a difference." Barlow laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering. "You best be careful, girl. The town has not forgotten what you are. A runaway, a thief, consorting with a known killer. You are walking on thin ice, and the river is rising." He was right about the town. When Clara walked to the mercantile to buy bandages, the women turned their backs. They pulled their children close. "That is her," she heard them whisper. The one who ruined herself. The one who dragged a good man's name through the mud. Men watched her from the saloon porch, their eyes heavy with a mixture of lust and contempt. They called her liar. They made bets on how long she would last before she came crawling back to the ranch house. Clara held her head high. She did not shrink. She let them look. She let them see that she was not ashamed. On the 5th day, Caleb's fever broke. He woke weak as a kitten, his face gray and gaunt, but his blue eyes were clear. "He is out," Caleb rasped, his voice a dry croak. Clara nodded, feeding him broth with a spoon. He will come for us," Caleb said. "He cannot let this stand." "I know," Clara said. "Let him come. We are not running anymore. The invitation came 2 days later. It was not a summons to court. It was a note, delivered by a terrified stable boy. Meet me at the Narrows, the old bridge, noon. Bring the ledgers, and I will let you live. If you do not come, I will burn the doctor's house with all of you inside." The Narrows was a desolate stretch of the canyon where the river was squeezed between high limestone walls. It was miles from town, far from witnesses. It was a place for executions. Caleb tried to stand, reaching for his gun belt. His knees buckled. "You cannot ride," Clara said, catching him. "You will bleed out before we get there." "I am not letting you go alone," Caleb growled, leaning heavily against the wall. "I am not going alone," Clara said. She turned to the door. "Doctor." Lowe stood there, holding a double-barreled shotgun. Beside him was the timber surveyor who had been fired, and the Chinese rail worker who had rapped Caleb's head, and behind them, looking terrified but determined, was the widow Hennessy. "We are all going," Clara said. They rode out in a wagon, the wheels churning through the mud that reached the hubs. Caleb lay in the back, propped up on sacks of grain, his Winchester across his lap. He was too weak to walk, but his aim was still true. The Narrows roared with the sound of the swollen river. The water was high, a frothing brown violence that shook the wooden pilings of the old bridge. Silas was waiting on the far side. He was not alone. He had 6 men with him, riders with dusters covering their guns. Silas sat on a black stallion, looking impeccable despite the mud. He watched the wagon approach. He saw Clara driving. He saw the ragtag group of allies. He saw the barrel of Caleb's rifle poking out from the canvas in the back. He smiled, but it was tight. "You brought an audience," Silas shouted over the roar of the water. "How dramatic." Clara stopped the wagon 20 yards from the bridge. She stood up on the bench seat. She held the oilcloth bundle of ledgers high in the air. "I brought the truth." "Silas!" she yelled. Silas rode his horse onto the creaking bridge. The timber groaned under the weight. He stopped in the middle, suspended over the raging water. "Give me the books." "Clara," he said. His voice dropped to a cajoling, reasonable tone. "Look at you, living in filth, nursing a broken man. Is this the life you want? I can forgive you. I can take you back. You will have warmth. You will have status. No one will dare whisper about you if you are my wife." Clara looked at him. She looked at the velvet collar of his coat, the gold rings on his fingers. She thought of the warm room with the blue wallpaper. She thought of the locked door. She thought of the silence that suffocated the soul. "It is just a cage." "Silas," she called back, "you dress it in velvet, but it is a cage, and I would rather freeze in freedom than rot in your comfort." Silas's face twisted. The mask of the benevolent lover fell away, revealing the predator beneath. "Then you will die in the dirt," he spat. He raised his hand to signal his men, but Clara was faster. "Now!" she screamed. From the rocks above the canyon rim, a dozen shapes appeared. It was not an army. It was the miners. It was the rail workers. It was the people Silas had cheated. They stood on the high ground, armed with picks, shovels, and old hunting rifles. Silas's men looked up. They saw they were outflanked. They saw that the valley had turned against them. One of the hired guns spat on the ground, wheeled his horse, and rode away. Then another. They were paid to fight, not to die for a losing cause. Silas screamed at them. "Cowards! Come back! I pay you. I own you." He was alone on the bridge. Caleb sat up in the wagon. He raised his rifle. He had a clear shot at Silas's chest. Clara looked back at him. She saw the tremor in his hands. Not from fear, but from the effort of holding back the rage. "Do it!" Silas screamed, spreading his arms. "Make me a martyr, you savage! Show them I was right about you!" Caleb looked at the man who had ruined his life. He looked at the rushing water below. He lowered the rifle. "No," Caleb said. His voice was not loud, but it carried. "I am not the monster you need me to be. I am done killing for you." Silas stared at him, baffled by the mercy. Then he looked at Clara. He saw the pity in her eyes. It was the pity that broke him. He fumbled for his pistol. He yanked it from his holster. Wild and panicked, he fired blindly at the wagon. The shot went wide, but the noise terrified his horse. The stallion reared, its hooves slipping on the wet, rotting timber of the bridge. Silas flailed, grabbing for the saddle horn, but his weight shifted too far. With a scream that was swallowed by the roar of the river, Silas Thorne fell. He hit the brown water and was gone instantly, sucked under by the current, weighed down by his heavy coat and the gold in his pockets. The horse scrambled to safety on the far bank. The bridge stood empty. There was a long silence, broken only by the rush of the water. Clara sat down slowly on the wagon bench. She did not cheer. She did not weep. She just breathed, feeling the air fill her lungs, clean and cold and hers. The aftermath was not a parade. It was a slow, messy untangling of knots. Sheriff Barlow fled the county 2 days later, taking the contents of the town safe with him. A federal marshal arrived from Denver to sort through the ledgers. The widow Hennessy got her farm back, though the legal fees took half her savings. The town did not apologize. People in the West rarely admitted they were wrong. They just stopped talking about it. The shopkeeper, Mr. Henderson, served Clara when she came in for flour, but he did not meet her eyes. The church ladies still crossed the street, but they no longer whispered loud enough to be heard. Clara did not care. She had not fought for their approval. She had fought for her life. She grieved. In the quiet evenings, she cried for the innocence she had lost. She cried for the relationship with her father, which was broken beyond repair. She cried for the girl who had believed that obedience would bring happiness. But beneath the grief, there was a foundation of steel. She owned her own breath. She owned her own mistakes. When the mud finally dried and the wildflowers began to bloom in the meadows, Clara and Caleb packed the wagon. They did not stay in the valley. The air there was too thick with memories. They went up. They returned to the high country, to a valley near the timberline where the air was thin and sweet. They did not go back to the dark, hidden cabin. They chose a meadow with a view of the peaks, a place filled with light. They built a homestead. It was hard work. Caleb was still weak, his shoulders stiff and aching, so Clara swung the axe. She learned to notch logs, to mix clay for chinking, to lay a roof that would hold the winter snow. They worked side by side. There was no division of labor based on what a woman should do. There was only what needed to be done. Caleb watched her with a reverence that never faded. He saw her strength, her capability, and he marveled at it. The romantic hope returned slowly, like the grass growing over a burn scar. At first, they were careful with each other. The violence of the last month sat between them, but as the house took shape, the distance closed. It was in the small moments. Caleb bringing her a cup of water from the creek, his fingers brushing hers. Clara shaving his face, her hand resting on his scarred cheek. One evening, as the sun set behind the sawtooths, turning the sky a bruised purple, they sat on the unfinished porch. Caleb reached out and took her hand. His grip was strong again, but gentle. "You saved me," he said quietly. "I was dead in that cave. Clara, even before you found me, I was just waiting for the dirt to cover me." Clara looked at him. She traced the line of his jaw. "We saved each other," she said. He pulled her into his lap. The desire that rose between them was not the frantic, desperate hunger of the fugitive days. It was deep and steady. It was braided with trust. It was the desire of two people who knew the worst of each other and chose the best. That night, they did not bar the door. They left it unlatched because they were no longer hiding. They made love on a mattress filled with sweet grass, the smell of fresh pine resin around them. It was slow and deliberate. It was a claiming of the future. But the West was not a fairy tale. 6 months later, a rider appeared on the ridge. He sat there for a long time, watching the cabin. Caleb was chopping wood. He did not look up, but Clara saw him shift his stance, moving his rifle closer to the block. The rider turned and left. It might have been a traveler. It might have been one of Silas's old associates, looking for revenge. It might have been a ghost. Clara walked out to the porch. She watched the dust settle where the rider had been. She knew that safety was never guaranteed. The world was full of men who wanted to take, to own, to destroy. But as she looked at Caleb, who wiped his brow and smiled at her, a genuine, open smile that reached his eyes, she knew they could face it. They had chosen the open road. They had chosen the hard earth. They had chosen each other. Clara picked up a bucket and walked toward the creek. The water was cold and clear. The wind blew through the pines, singing a song of endurance. It was not a perfect piece. It was jagged and hard-won. But it was real, and it was theirs. Thank you for listening to this story of resilience, justice, and love in the untamed West. I hope Clara and Caleb's journey resonated with you. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on the story in English. Did you agree with how they handled Silas? If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to the channel From Wild West for more stories of the frontier. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your eyes on the horizon.